April 16, 1945. The air above the Ruhr Valley trembled with violence. It was early afternoon, the sun a pale disk behind layers of industrial haze that clung to the German heartland like a shroud. Below, the factories and rail yards that had once powered the Third Reich's war machine lay broken and smoldering, victims of relentless Allied bombing. The sky itself seemed wounded, scarred by black clouds of flak that erupted in rhythmic fury, each burst a blossom of shrapnel and fire designed to tear apart anything foolish enough to fly through it. The air tasted of cordite and smoke. The sound was constant, a dull, percussive thunder that rolled across the heavens without pause. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. Lieutenant William J. Cullerton sat in the cramped cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, his hands steady on the control stick despite the chaos erupting around him. He was alone, separated from his squadron during a running engagement with German fighters, his radio filled with static and fragmented voices. The mission had been a fighter sweep, a hunt for the remnants of the Luftwaffe across western Germany, but somewhere over the Ruhr, the hunted had become the hunters. A pair of Focke-Wulf FW-190s had appeared from nowhere, diving out of a cloud bank with guns blazing. Cullerton had evaded, twisted, rolled, standard defensive maneuvers. But in doing so, he had lost altitude, lost his wingman, lost the safety of numbers. Now he flew alone, skimming low over the devastated landscape, with two German fighters locked onto his tail and the entire German anti-aircraft network below, awakening to his presence. The first flak burst detonated 300 yards ahead, a black sphere that materialized in the air as if conjured by malice itself. Cullerton felt the shockwave ripple through his aircraft, a sharp jolt that rattled the airframe. Another burst erupted to his left, then his right. The German gunners were ranging in, adjusting their fire, walking their shells closer with each volley. He was flying straight into a corridor of death, and behind him, the two FW-190s pressed their advantage, closing the distance, their cannon rounds tracing bright lines through the smoke. Cullerton's mind raced. He could not outclimb the fighters. They had the altitude advantage. He could not outrun them. The FW-190 was fast, brutal, and in the hands of experienced pilots. He could not turn and fight. 2 against 1 at low altitude was suicide. The flak was intensifying, a curtain of steel rising to meet him. Every instinct screamed at him to break away, to climb, to escape. Instead, he flew deeper into the flak. The German fighters followed, and then suddenly they did not. On the ground, in the fire control centers that coordinated the anti-aircraft batteries, confusion erupted. Telephone lines crackled with frantic reports. Radio operators shouted over one another. And somewhere in that chaos, a voice cut through. Sharp, disbelieving, almost panicked. "He's using our flak!" By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany had become the most lethal airspace in the world. The Luftwaffe, though battered, still possessed skilled pilots and dangerous aircraft. But more feared than the fighters was the flak, the anti-aircraft artillery that ringed every city, every factory, every rail junction, and military installation across the Reich. The Germans had invested enormous resources into air defense, and by the war's end, they had deployed more than 20,000 heavy flak guns, each capable of hurling high explosive shells to altitudes of 30,000 feet or more. Flak was democratic in its brutality. It did not care about skill or experience. It did not distinguish between veteran and novice. It simply filled the sky with steel, and if you were unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when a shell detonated, you died. Allied aircrews feared it more than fighters. At least with a fighter, you could maneuver, evade, fight back. Against flak, you could only fly through it and hope the odds favored you. The flak batteries around the Ruhr Valley were among the heaviest in Germany. The region was vital, an industrial core that produced steel, munitions, and machinery. Its defense was a matter of national survival. The batteries were coordinated through a sophisticated network of radar stations, observation posts, and fire control centers. When an aircraft entered the defense zone, the guns opened fire in sequence, creating overlapping fields of fire that formed a deadly cage. The The gunners used predictive calculations, adjusting for altitude, speed, and trajectory. They aimed not at where the aircraft was, but where it would be 3 seconds later when the shell arrived. Against a bomber flying straight and level, the system was devastatingly effective. Against a fighter maneuvering wildly at low altitude, it was less precise but still lethal. The sheer volume of fire compensated for reduced accuracy. Sooner or later, you flew into a burst, and when you did, the shrapnel, jagged fragments traveling at supersonic speeds, would shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, and tear through flesh and aluminum alike. William Cullerton knew all of this. Every Allied pilot knew it. It was drilled into them during training, reinforced by the sight of friends who did not return, confirmed by the empty bunks and missing faces at evening mess. Flak was the enemy you could not fight. You simply endured it. But on that April afternoon, flying low over the Ruhr with 2 German fighters closing in, Cullerton made a decision that defied everything he had been taught. He decided to use the Flak as a weapon. The FW-190 pilots expected the American to brake left or right, to dive for the deck, to try some desperate evasive maneuver. What they did not expect was for him to fly straight into the densest concentration of flak. The first burst erupted directly ahead of Cullerton's Mustang, a black explosion that should have been his death. He flew through the smoke, the shrapnel scattering around him, pieces of steel pinging off the fuselage. His airspeed indicator jumped. The controls shuddered. He ignored it. Another burst. He adjusted his course slightly, angling toward the explosion rather than away from it. It was insanity. Every instinct, every hour of training screamed against it. But he had noticed something. The flak bursts were timed, predictable. The German gunners were aiming ahead of his flight path, creating a barrier. If he flew into the bursts, into the smoke and debris of exploded shells, he was flying into space the gunners had already calculated. Space they believed was clear. Space where the next shells would not be. Behind him, the FW-190s hesitated. Their pilots were not fools. They had flown over the Ruhr hundreds of times. They knew the flak patterns, knew the kill zones, knew that the gunners below did not distinguish between friend and foe when the shooting started. The standing orders were clear. When the flake opened up, German aircraft withdrew. The risk of friendly fire was too great. But the Mustang was not withdrawing. It was flying deeper into the barrage, weaving between bursts with a precision that seemed impossible. The German pilots shouted into their radios, warning the flak batteries, demanding they cease fire. But the batteries did not stop. They could not stop. Their orders were to shoot down the American fighter. The fact that German planes were in the area was secondary. Another burst. Cullerton banked hard, rolling the Mustang onto its side, threading between 2 explosions that erupted simultaneously. The smoke enveloped him. For a moment, he was blind, flying on instruments alone, trusting speed and heading, praying. The airframe would hold. Then he was through, bursting back into clear air, the twin black clouds receding behind him. The FW-190s broke off. One climbed sharply, pulling away from the flak zone. The other banked left, abandoning the pursuit. They had lost sight of the Mustang in the smoke, and they had no intention of dying to their own guns. The radios were chaos now, ground controllers demanding to know what was happening, fighter pilots cursing, flak crews insisting they had the target locked. Cullerton flew on. Another burst. He adjusted. Another. He rolled. The Mustang became an extension of his body, responding to inputs almost before he made them. He was not thinking anymore, not consciously. He was reacting, operating on instinct and reflex, honed by hundreds of hours in the cockpit. The flak bursts became a rhythm, a deadly percussion that he learned to anticipate. The smoke became cover. The very thing designed to kill him became his shield. 11 bursts in total. 11. Explosions that he flew into, through, or around. 11 moments where death missed him by yards, by feet, by inches. And then suddenly, he was clear. The flak stopped. The sky ahead was empty. He was beyond the defense perimeter, beyond the kill zone, beyond the reach of the guns. He was alive. On the ground, in the fire control centers, there was silence. Then confusion, then anger. The battery commanders demanded explanations. How had the American escaped? How had he flown through 11 bursts and emerged unscathed? The gunners insisted they had aimed true. The predictive calculations had been correct. The shells had detonated on target. But the American had done the impossible. He had turned their weapons against them. He had used the smoke, the explosions, the very predictability of their system to create a path through the barrage. And in doing so, he had done something no one had thought possible. The report filtered up through the chain of command. Strange, almost. Unbelievable, but confirmed by multiple observers. A single American fighter had flown into the Flak, evaded 11 direct bursts, and escaped. The FW-190 pilots filed their own reports, describing the pursuit and the sudden, suicidal maneuver that had ended it. They did not claim victory. There was no victory to claim. The American had simply vanished into the smoke and did not come out as wreckage. For the German air defense network, it was a small failure in a war filled with larger ones. But it was also a moment of realization. The Americans were no longer predictable. They no longer followed the rules of engagement that the Germans understood. They had become improvisational, adaptive, willing to take insane risks if those risks offered a path to survival. It was a microcosm of the larger strategic reality. Germany had entered the war with doctrine, with systems, with carefully constructed plans for every contingency. But the Americans had entered with flexibility, with industrial capacity, and with a cultural willingness to try the impossible if the impossible might work. The P-51 Mustang that William Cullerton flew that day was more than just a machine. It was a symbol, a physical manifestation of American industrial power and engineering excellence. Each Mustang represented thousands of hours of labor, millions of dollars in investment, and the coordinated efforts of factories, engineers, and workers spread across an entire continent. The Merlin engine that powered it was a marvel of precision manufacturing. The aluminum alloy that formed its airframe was produced in quantities Germany could no longer dream of. The fuel it burned arrived in endless convoys across the Atlantic, delivered by a logistics network that stretched from Texas oil fields to English airstrips. But beyond the material, the Mustang represented a philosophy. It was designed to be flown by individuals, pilots who were trained to think, to adapt, to make decisions in the chaos of combat. American pilot training emphasized initiative and flexibility. Pilots were given extensive flight hours, taught aerobatics and gunnery, and encouraged to develop their own tactics. They were not expected to follow rigid doctrine. They were expected to survive and complete the mission by whatever means necessary. German pilots, by contrast, operated within a system that valued discipline and adherence to established tactics. Initiative was not discouraged exactly, but it was bounded by doctrine. There was a right way to engage an enemy, a right way to evade, a right way to coordinate with ground forces. And in the early years of the war, when Germany held the initiative and controlled the tempo of operations, that system worked brilliantly. But by 1945, the tempo had shifted. The Allies controlled the skies. The Americans could afford to lose aircraft and pilots. They would be replaced. The Germans could not. And in that environment, the American emphasis on individual initiative became a critical advantage. A German pilot who broke formation or deviated from tactics risked reprimand. An American pilot who did the same might be commended for creative thinking. William Cullerton's decision to fly into the Flak was not something that could have been planned or taught. It was an act of improvisation born of desperation and possibility. And it worked because he had been trained to trust his instincts, because he flew an aircraft capable of responding to split-second inputs, and because he operated within a military culture that rewarded results over adherence to procedure. There is a recurring image in the accounts of that day: the smoke, black, roiling clouds of it, generated by the Flak bursts, lingering in the air like dark monuments to near misses and narrow escapes. Cullerton flew through that smoke again and again, using it as concealment, gambling that the German gunners would not fire blindly into their own explosions. The smoke became his ally, a curtain that hid him from the fighters, a screen that confused the fire control systems below. Smoke is an apt symbol for the air war over Germany in 1945. It obscured everything: targets, intentions, outcomes. The Germans fought through the smoke of their burning cities, their collapsing infrastructure, their disintegrating command networks. They could no longer see clearly. They could no longer predict what the enemy would do. All they could do was fire into the haze and hope. The Americans, by contrast, flew through the smoke with instruments that still functioned, with fuel tanks that were still full, with the knowledge that behind them stretched an entire continent untouched by war. They could afford to take risks. They could afford to try the impossible, because even if they failed, even if they died, the mission would continue. Another pilot would take their place. Another aircraft would roll off the assembly line. Another convoy would deliver fuel and bombs and ammunition. That disparity between a nation fighting in the smoke and a nation that could see beyond it defined the final year of the war, and it explained why a single American pilot could turn a flak barrage into an escape route. When Cullerton landed back at his base in England hours later, his aircraft was a mess. The fuselage was peppered with shrapnel holes, small punctures that leaked hydraulic fluid and told the story of how close he had come to death. The ground crew counted more than 30 distinct impacts, pieces of steel that had struck the Mustang without penetrating critical systems. Any one of them could have been fatal. None of them were. During the debriefing, Cullerton described the encounter in his usual understated manner. He had been pursued by German fighters. He had flown into the flak to evade them. The Germans had broken off. He had escaped. When the intelligence officer pressed for details, how had he known where to fly? How had he avoided the bursts? Cullerton shrugged. I watched where they were shooting, he said, and I flew into the smoke. It sounded simple. It was anything but. What Cullerton had done required split-second timing, absolute confidence in his aircraft, and a willingness to ignore every survival instinct evolution had bequeathed to the human species. He had flown toward explosions. He had used the enemy's weapons as tools. He had gambled his life on the assumption that German gunnery doctrine would create predictable gaps in the barrage. And he had been right. The story spread quickly through the squadron, then the group, then the entire 8th Air Force. It became one of those tales that seemed too incredible to be true, until the gun camera footage was reviewed and the ground crew confirmed the damage. A pilot had flown through a flak barrage, not around it. He had used the explosions as cover. He had survived. For the other pilots, it was both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it proved that even the most hopeless situations could be survived with the right combination of skill and audacity. Terrifying because it suggested that survival increasingly required acts that defied sanity. In Germany, the incident was filed away in the growing mountain of reports documenting the war's inexorable turn. The FW-190 pilots who had pursued Cullerton submitted their accounts. The flak battery commanders filed their own. Somewhere in a headquarters bunker, an analyst noted the occurrence and moved on to the next crisis. There were so many crises now. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were approaching Berlin. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, out of pilots, out of time. But for the men who had witnessed Cullerton's escape, the fighter pilots, the flak crews, the observers on the ground, the memory lingered. They had seen something unprecedented. An American pilot had not just survived their defenses, he had turned those defenses against them. He had exploited the very systems designed to kill him, using German predictability as a weapon. It was a small thing in the grand scale of the war, one pilot, one escape, but it was also a revelation. The Americans were not just winning because they had more planes and more pilots. They were winning because they thought differently. They improvised. They adapted. They did not wait for orders or doctrine. They acted. For a military culture built on discipline and hierarchy, it was a difficult truth to accept. But by April 1945, denial was no longer an option. The evidence was written in the sky above every German city, in the wreckage of every downed Luftwaffe fighter, in the faces of pilots who returned from missions shaken and hollow-eyed. The Americans were not better soldiers, but they were soldiers of a different kind. And that difference, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of missions, had become insurmountable. There is a certain poetry in the image of Cullerton's Mustang threading through the flak bursts, smoke and fire erupting around it, the aircraft rolling and diving with balletic precision. It was a dance with death, a performance where every misstep meant annihilation, but where grace and timing could cheat the odds. But it was not poetry that saved Cullerton. It was engineering. It was training. It was the accumulated advantage of a nation that could afford to build the best aircraft, train its pilots for hundreds of hours, and send them into combat confident that if they fell, they would not fall in vain. The Mustang absorbed the shrapnel that should have killed him. The engine kept running, despite impacts that would have crippled lesser machines. The control surfaces responded even when hydraulic lines were severed. Every system had redundancies. Every component had been tested to destruction and rebuilt stronger. The aircraft was a product of American industrial philosophy. Overbuild, over-engineer, ensure that the machine can survive punishment and keep fighting. German aircraft, by contrast, were often masterpieces of efficiency. They were designed to do exactly what was needed, with no wasted weight or unnecessary complexity. In the hands of skilled pilots, they were formidable. But they had narrow margins. A single hit in the wrong place could bring them down. They were scalpels, precise and deadly. The Mustang was a hammer, and by 1945, the war favored hammers. After the war, historians would analyze the incident in exhaustive detail. They would note the specific flak battery positions, the altitude and speed of Cullerton's Mustang, the timing of the bursts. They would create diagrams showing his flight path, illustrating how he wove between explosions. Some would call it luck, others would call it skill, a few would call it genius. All of them would be partially correct. Cullerton had been lucky. Lucky that none of the shrapnel hit a critical system. Lucky that the German fighters broke off when they did. Lucky that the smoke obscured him at exactly the right moments. But he had also been skilled enough to recognize the pattern in the flak bursts, skilled enough to fly his aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope, skilled enough to keep his nerve when every rational impulse screamed at him to run. And perhaps there was genius in it too, the kind of genius that arises not from careful planning, but from desperation and insight colliding in the heat of the moment. The ability to see a weapon aimed at you and think, how can I use this? That was the American advantage, distilled into a single act. Not superior technology alone, though that helped. Not superior numbers alone, though those were overwhelming. But the cultural capacity to look at a system, even an enemy system designed to kill you, and ask, how can I turn this to my advantage? In the decades after the war, William Cullerton did not speak often about that day. When asked, he would describe it in the same matter-of-fact terms he used in the original debriefing. He had been in trouble. He had made a decision. It had worked. That was all. But those who knew him noted that he kept a photograph on his desk, a picture of his Mustang after that mission, the fuselage riddled with holes, the ground crew standing beside it with expressions caught between admiration and disbelief. He never explained why he kept it. Perhaps it reminded him of how fragile survival had been. Perhaps it reminded him of what he had been capable of when necessity demanded it. Or perhaps it reminded him of something larger, that the war had not been won by machines or numbers alone, but by men who refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. Men who looked at impossible situations and found unlikely solutions. Men who flew into the smoke because the smoke was the only place left to go. April 16, 1945, was not a turning point in the war. By then, Germany's collapse was inevitable. The Allied armies were tightening the noose. The Luftwaffe was a spent force. The flak batteries still fired, but they were firing at an enemy that had already won. But in the chaos above the Ruhr Valley, in the narrow corridor between earth and sky where the flak bursts bloomed and faded, a single pilot demonstrated something that statistics and strategic analyses could not fully capture. He demonstrated that individual will, backed by superior equipment and the freedom to act, could defy systems designed to eliminate that will. The German gunners had done everything right. They had calculated trajectories, coordinated fire, created a kill zone that should have been impassable. And yet, the American had passed through. Not by luck alone, though luck played a role, but by recognizing that the very predictability of the system created exploitable gaps. By understanding that the enemy's strength, their coordinated doctrinal approach, could become a weakness if confronted with someone willing to act unpredictably. It was a lesson written in smoke and steel, in the shrapnel scars on a Mustang's fuselage, in the confused reports filed by German commanders who could not explain how their trap had failed. And it was a lesson that echoed across the final days of the war. The Americans did not fight by German rules. They did not respect German systems. They improvised, adapted, and survived by whatever means necessary. And in a war that had become a grinding contest of attrition, that flexibility, that willingness to use the enemy's weapons against them became the edge that could not be blunted. There is a moment, preserved in the gun camera footage from Cullerton's Mustang, where the aircraft emerges from a cloud of smoke directly into clear air. For a fraction of a second, the wings are perfectly level, the horizon visible beyond the canopy, the smoke receding behind like a curtain pulled back. And then, the aircraft banks, rolls, and dives into the next burst. It is a fleeting image, easily missed in the chaos of the footage, but it captures something essential. The moment between death and survival, the instant where the gamble pays off and the impossible becomes real. That moment, multiplied across thousands of missions, enacted by thousands of pilots over hundreds of battlefields, was the story of the Allied air war. Not grand strategies or overwhelming force alone, though those mattered, but countless individual moments where men made choices, took risks, and refused to accept the limitations imposed by doctrine or circumstance. William Cullerton's decision to fly into the Flak was one such moment. It should not have worked. By every rational calculation, it should have ended with a burst of shrapnel through the cockpit, a Mustang tumbling from the sky, another name added to the long list of those who did not return. But it did work, and in working, it revealed a fundamental truth about the war's final year, that Germany, for all its skill and determination, was fighting with systems that had become rigid and predictable. And the Americans, for all their youth and inexperience, were fighting with a flexibility that rendered those systems vulnerable. The sky above the Ruhr is quiet now. The factories have been rebuilt or abandoned. The rail yards carry civilian freight. The flak batteries were dismantled decades ago, their guns melted down or preserved in museums. The men who fought there, American and German alike, are gone, their stories preserved in after-action reports, faded photographs, and the memories of those few who remain. But the lesson endures. Freedom is not just a political state or an ideological position. It is a way of thinking, a willingness to act outside the boundaries of what is expected or prescribed. It is the confidence to look at a system designed to kill you and ask, how can I use this? It is the audacity to fly into the smoke when every instinct says to flee. That audacity, backed by the industrial might of a nation that could build 50,000 fighters and send them into combat, flown by pilots trained to think for themselves. That was the weapon Germany could not counter. Not because it was overwhelmingly powerful in any single engagement, but because it was endlessly adaptable, impossible to predict, and relentless in its application. William Cullerton did not win the war that day, but he demonstrated why the war was being won. He showed that the side which could improvise, which could turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses, which could survive the unsurvivable through creativity and skill, that side would prevail. And when the German radios erupted with the panicked realization, he's using our flak! It was not just a tactical observation. It was an acknowledgement of something deeper and more devastating, that the Americans had learned to fight a different kind of war, a war where the rules could be rewritten in an instant, where survival depended on thinking faster than the enemy's systems could adapt, where freedom of action was the ultimate weapon. In the smoke and fire above the Ruhr Valley, in the 11 bursts that should have ended one man's life but instead became his salvation, that truth was written in steel and sky, and it could not be denied. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.